Please become a patron of Myth Vision Podcast. Get access to everything early. Help us grow. Ian Mills, host of New Testament Review Podcast on YouTube. Ladies and gentlemen, go down in the description. Make sure you guys subscribe to his channel. Check out his Patreon or any other ways that he has possible to help him out. We're going to talk about the Gospel of Peter.
Yeah.
Peter must have written this one himself, right?
Well, it does seem to claim that. The Gospel of Peter. Peter speaks, I, Peter, at the very end. This is a really interesting gospel. We actually knew about it before we discovered it, because Eusebius discusses this. And I think Origen cites it as well. Eusebius tells us that there was a bishop Serapion, and Serapion was from Antioch. And Serapion discovered, there's this letter that Eusebius quotes of Serapion's, that Serapion wrote to a church. And Serapion says, when I was among you, you asked me if it was okay to read the Gospel of Peter, to use the Gospel of Peter in your church. And I said it was fine. Since then, I've gotten home and got a copy of this Gospel for myself. I got it from a certain sect of Christians. And have looked through it, and it contains mostly really good stuff, he says. Most of this, no problem, it looks like the teachings of Jesus. But there are some passages in it that support a docetic Christology. Now, docetism comes from the Greek word dokeo, meaning to seem, to appear. And the docetists, docetic, is probably not something anybody ever called themselves. Rather, it's a term you use to label somebody else who believes things about Jesus, particularly about Jesus' body, that you think are bad, you think are insufficient. For instance, Christians labeled docetic certain other Christians who believed that Jesus wasn't born of a virgin, just appeared one day, was walking around the earth. So those were docetists. Christians also labeled a group docetic that believed that Jesus was born normally, was a normal human being, but that the Christ, the second person of the Trinity, or some sort of divine figure or God in some way, came down and entered into Jesus and then left him before he died.
Like at baptism?
Yep, exactly, at the baptism. Both of these groups get called docetic. So again, these groups probably are not friends. These groups are not part of the Church of the Docetists. This is a term, so often we find these terms that we get from heresiological sources, from other polemics, doesn't describe someone's self-understanding, but rather describes how opponents are describing other people. So anyways, so what does Serapion actually tell us? Well, he tells us that there was a gospel of Peter that was mostly good stuff, but contained some theology in it, some texts about Peter, or about Jesus rather, that supported a view of Jesus and or Jesus' body that could be interpreted by docetics, that is, by people that Serapion felt had a bad view of Jesus' body. Okay, fast forward, and we have the Akhmim Codex. And we find in the Akhmim Codex a fragment, it's been copied, and it starts mid-sentence, of a gospel that ends with Peter saying, I, Peter. It describes Peter himself as the speaker. And this is what we refer to now as the Gospel of Peter. And it's a retelling of the Passion narrative of Jesus. So we have, it starts in the trial before Pilate, and then it switches over, and then we get the death of Jesus, and then we get, most famously, the only, at least the first, depiction of what it actually looked like to be there when Jesus was rising from the dead. So we talk about Mark not having a resurrection account, right? Well, in a sense, none of the Gospels have a resurrection account, right? People show up after Jesus is resurrected.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. They see Jesus risen, they see the risen Lord, and they see the empty tomb, but nobody actually describes Jesus rising. Nobody but the Gospel of Peter.
Peter himself, right?
Yeah, well, of course, nobody thinks Peter wrote this text. No, but it's worth saying. We're on YouTube. It's worth saying nobody believes Peter wrote the Gospel of Peter. So, what does this text say? Well, this text is full of interesting tidbits. This text has some pretty radically anti-Judaic teachings. It is probably picking up on an ambiguity from the Gospel of Luke, that there's an ambiguous they who is crucifying Jesus, but makes it explicit that Rome doesn't crucify Jesus the way that Rome does in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Rather, it's the Judeans themselves who Pilate gives him to the Judeans, and they go off and crucify Jesus. Which, of course, is not how things worked historically, and also it's not what the other Gospels say. But this text is placing the blame on the Judeans over and over again. They refuse to wash their hands like Pilate did. So you have this emphasis on the blame of at least the Jewish leadership. Joel Marcus has written an article arguing that this actually isn't a depiction of all the Judeans. The Judeans actually seem to repent after their death and resurrection. This is a critique specifically of the Jewish leaders. You can read that piece by Joel Marcus yourself. But, so that's one difference. Is there anything in this gospel that might make us think, hints of the docetic Christology? Well, yeah, maybe. It's controversial, and my position on this is that this is, we only have one copy of a gospel that claims to be written by Peter. We have one description of someone named Peter writing someone saying Peter wrote a gospel. This all seems to, fit together. And there are things in this text, I would argue, that can be interpreted docetically, that can be interpreted as supporting a view of Jesus' body that was not what Serapion and Eusebius wanted to accept. That is not the proto-Orthodox view, what became the Orthodox view of Jesus' body. I would say, though, that I don't think the Gospel of Peter was written by someone who had this view. I think it supports their interpretation. It can be used to support their interpretation, just like the Gospel of Mark, when it says the Spirit went into Jesus. There were docetic Christians. There were Christians who other people thought had a bad view of Jesus' body, who used that to support docetic views. It doesn't mean the Gospel of Mark was written by someone who believes Christ entered Jesus at the baptism. I think pretty clearly Mark doesn't believe that. So what is it? Well, a couple things. Jesus dies and is silent, as if, hos is the Greek word, he didn't feel any pain. This could mean, the grammar is ambiguously, it could mean that Jesus actually didn't feel any pain, as feeling no pain, or it could be that he died with such stoicism that he was silent as if he wasn't feeling pain, even though he was. And in fact, if you go look at other early Christian martyr texts, if you go look at texts about the death of philosophers, dying as if you're not feeling pain, remaining composed, is something how you depict heroic deaths. So probably the most plausible reading is not saying that Jesus didn't feel pain, which would be like the docetic view, but saying he died composed, which the Gospels are also interested in portraying to different degrees, right? We have the cry of dereliction, "Oh my God, why have you forsaken me?" In Mark and Matthew, but we get a much more composed portrayal of Jesus in John, and to a middling degree Luke. The cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." Lama sabachthani, is also rewritten in the Gospel of Peter. And this one sets off alarm bells right away for people who think maybe this is docetic. Instead it says, "My power, why have you forsaken me?" Sounds kind of docetic, sounds kind of Gnostic, right? And totally you can see how someone saying, "My power has forsaken me," might sound like what other early Christians believed, that certain heretics believed, that the God, the divine part of Jesus left him before he died. We have texts that describe this, from Nag Hammadi, for instance, Gnostic texts. But I think that's also implausible. In fact, we know there were Second Temple Jews, non-Christian people, who rendered that psalm, which is being quoted by the Gospel of Peter and Mark alike, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and substituted the word power for God as a way of showing respect for the divine name. And so the fact that we know this translation existed in the ancient world of translating the psalm that way probably suggests that this is just somebody updating the citation, making sure the citation is very clear. And we see that already in the gospel traditions. It's super common to find one gospel rewriting another gospel and harmonizing or comporting the citation to more closely agree with another text form of the scriptures. You come across Jesus quoting a passage and you say, oh, hold on, that's not the version of the Bible I'm familiar with. And you come along and you fix that. So probably that's what's happening in the Gospel of Peter too.
Is this the same gospel that a cross was talking?
Oh, you think the walking, talking cross might be interesting to listeners?
I was actually going to say, I think that's historical. But, what happened? So did you go in, you went to the death. My God, my power, why have you forsaken me? But like, what happened to the resurrection?
Yeah, so we get a depiction of the resurrection. Angels come down, the tomb opens up, and by the way, in the Gospel of Peter, there are not only Roman guards stationed like there are in Matthew, but also the Jewish leadership comes to the tombs to watch Jesus get resurrected. So everyone's seeing this happening. Again, part of the portrayal of the Jewish leaders as villains. Yeah. Angels come down, stone rolls away, and they go in and they lead out a procession. And the straightforward reading of the Greek of the only single surviving copy of the Gospel of Peter says the angels walk out with one in between them, Jesus in between them, and their heads are reaching into the heavens. They're huge. There's this description of them as being larger than life and gigantic. And following behind them came the cross. And a voice comes down from heaven and says, "Have you preached to the dead?" And the cross answers and says, "Yes, I preached to the dead." So the straightforward reading of the manuscripts, of the only surviving manuscript, suggests that a cross walked out behind Jesus and the angels and answered the voice from heaven, claiming that the cross preached to the dead. Now, I've said all this because I'm very skeptical of this reading.
Okay. Yeah,
but
I would too. I mean, you got a wooden stake talking.
Yes. No, I don't mean I'm skeptical of the historicity of this. This is a 2nd century gospel, I think, dependent on the Gospels. I'm skeptical that that's actually what the Gospel of Peter ever said.
Even if it was 2nd century, right?
Right. No, for sure. And this comes from a proposal made by Mark Goodacre with a sort of sordid legacy that I also would like to write a piece on this someday. But the proposal is that there's been an error. And if you go look at the manuscripts, for instance, the cross's response to the voice from heaven, there's some absolutely jumbled letters. We actually don't know what it says there, and we have to reconstruct it because there's a gap, and there's like a nonsense letter, and we have to sort of figure it out. And I think that's because a scribe has recognized that he's made a mistake. And the mistake, this is something Mark Goodacre, my advisor, noticed, is, I need to give a little bit of context. There's something in the manuscripts of the New Testament called Nomina sacra. And a fun bit of trivia that's technically true, but completely misleading, is that the name of Jesus never appears anywhere in the Bible, in any manuscript of the Bible, because scribes never write out Jesus' name. Scribes never write out the word God either. The word God, theos, never appears in the New Testament, any old manuscripts of the New Testament, because they don't write out the full word theos. They write theta, the first letter, and sigma, and put a line over it. It's an abbreviation. We call this nomina sacra, which are just sacred names. The origins of this practice is complicated, but suffice it to say, all of our early New Testament manuscripts have abbreviations for God, Jesus, Lord, Son, and a bunch of other words. Other common names. David, maybe because it's son of David, maybe for other reasons, gets abbreviated. And one of the words that's also abbreviated is cross and crucified one. The oldest copy of any gospel literature outside of Egypt is something called the Dura Europos fragment. It's a 3rd century fragment. We know it's at least 3rd century because the walls were destroyed and it was found in these walls. Fragment of the Gospels. And it has an abbreviation for the crucified one, which is something that 2nd century literature calls Jesus. just a way of referring to him in passing. Justin Martyr, for instance, will refer to Jesus as the crucified one all over the place. So, what you get then is not that written out in full. You get STR, or it would be, I don't know if they did the full ST, it might be just SA with a line over it. Or maybe it's STR. I'm not have to go look up what the abbreviation is.
Okay.
But there's an abbreviation. And Mark's brilliant theory is that the Gospel of Peter has taken the one surviving copy, has in front of him a text that says, the angels come down and proceed out of the tomb, and between them, and following with them is the crucified one, Jesus, not a cross.
Right.
And the voice from heaven says, have you preached to the dead? And Jesus responds, and the crucified one responds, I have. And this fits with other early Christian depictions. There's texts in the New Testament, and of course lots of other second century texts that tell us that Jesus preached to the dead. This is something he's supposed to have done on Holy Saturday while he was dead. Bunch of texts say this. Nobody ever says a cross preached to the dead.
Right.
So it fits perfectly. Moreover, and this is something that I'm not sure I've seen other people note before, the Ascension of Isaiah describes the resurrection of Jesus happening exactly like this. Angels come down and they lead out a gigantic Jesus. No cross. Just the crucified one. And so Mark's theory, that I think is a much more plausible reading of the Gospel of Peter, is that a scribe has seen this abbreviation. It's not a very common one. The crucified one abbreviation, Nomina sacra, is actually super uncommon. And said, this must have just been must be just cross. Must just be a muddled writing of cross. Doesn't recognize that it's supposed to be crucified one. He's copying a couple hundred years after this was stopped being conventional and just wrote in the word cross. And then the second time this happens, when the cross talks, he realizes, I have made a mistake. And this is where we get the jumble of letters. We get him just, I should keep going. And so, in fact, there is no walking, talking cross in the Gospel of Peter on this theory. There is just a scribe who wrote the crucified one out as the cross instead.
That's fascinating. And that makes more sense.
It does.
How someone would get that goofed up to begin with, it might be editor fatigue.
Well, that's editorial fatigue is a different phenomenon entirely.
Oh, is it?
But it's just scribes make mistakes. This is really, really common. And sometimes the scribal mistakes are interesting, and most of the time they produce nonsense.
Right.
But I think that's the most likely explanation.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.